This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa and today I'm continuing with my limited set review for Innistrad Crimson Vow. So far I've covered all the multicolored, colorless, and white cards, and today we're taking a look at blue. A few caveats before we get to our first card. Keep in mind I'm only talking about limited. I'm not talking about other formats or any cards that don't appear in draft boosters for this set. Also, these are my initial thoughts about the format before playing with the cards. I will put out videos with my updated thoughts on these cards over the next several weeks though. Lastly, I use a letter grade system to help sum up my thoughts on each of these cards, and if you don't know what those letter grades mean, you can find an explanation in the description. Alright, let's take a look at our first blue card. First up, it's Alchemists Retrieval, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant. It has Cleave for 1 generic and a blue, and this is a new mechanic in the set where you can pay an alternate cost to remove text that's in brackets on the card. And this card's effect says, return target non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand, and you control is in brackets. We see this kind of card a lot, and it's always kind of alright. This one is nice because if you want to bounce your own thing, you can pay less for it, and paying 2 mana to bounce an opposing permanent is kind of something we expect. This is never going to be anything special, but the first copy will often make the cut in blue decks. You're getting tempo out of it and not any sort of trade, so keep that in mind. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Binding Geist, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 3/1 spirit. At common, when it attacks, target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-0 until end of turn. And it has Disturb for 1 generic and a blue. It's a returning mechanic. It means you can pay this mana when this card's in your graveyard to have it come back. And in this case, it comes back as an aura. All of them in this set come back as auras. It comes back as Spectral Binding, an enchant creature aura. An enchanted creature gets -2/-0. So the attack trigger here won't usually make it so the Geist doesn't die in combat, but it does let you force your opponent into situations where the best they can do is trade, and that's not too bad, though it's not great either. I don't think having that ability in aura form is exactly exciting either when you disturb it. I think this is probably just a C-. Next up, it's Biolume Egg, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 0/4 Serpent Egg. At uncommon, it's got Defender. When it enters the battlefield, you scry 2, and whenever you sacrifice it, you return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. And it comes back as Biolume Serpent, a 4/4 Serpent that lets you sack 2 islands, and it can't be blocked this turn if you do that. So a 3 mana 0/4 that scries 2 is something that you would play in mid-range or control decks in limited anyway. Scry 2 has a very real impact on the quality of cards you draw, and this can slow people down on the ground. So the upside is that sacrificing this gives you a 4/4 that's sometimes unblockable, and that seems pretty sweet. Exploit is a mechanic in this set. We haven't seen it yet in this video, but suffice it to say it's a mechanic that lets you sacrifice things, and that means that sacrificing this won't really be that difficult to do. In fact, the scry might even help you find something that lets you sacrifice Biolume Egg. I'm giving this a B. It looks like a really good uncommon. Next up, it's Cemetery Illuminator, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a 2/3 spirit at Mythic Rare. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you exile a card from a graveyard. You may look at the top card of your library anytime, and once each turn, you may cast a spell from the top of your library if it shares a card type with a card exiled with Cemetery Illuminator. Like the others in this cycle, this is really good. A 2/3 flyer for 3 that can hate on a graveyard is a great place to start, and the fact that this lets you start casting stuff off of the top is amazing. Now, you do have to have things to target to really get to reap the rewards of that effect, but if you hit a creature or a land, you're going to be able to play cards off the top pretty consistently. Note, by the way, it does limit how many times you can do it in a turn. We've seen similar effects like this that just let you rip through cards off the top of your library. Not going to be the case here. You can only do it once a turn, but that's still going to be pretty great. You're going to draw a bunch of cards with this and have a decently efficient flyer. I think that's enough for this to get in the lower range of bomb status. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Chill of the Grave, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant. It costs 1 less to cast if you control a zombie, and it says tap target creature. It doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step, draw a card. This sort of effect is always pretty decent when paired with a draw effect. If you can pay 2 for this consistently, it will feel especially good. And the nice thing here is it looks reasonably well suited for both blue-black and blue-red, which are zombies and spells respectively. You generally want to use this type of effect aggressively to alter the race, because that lets you take 2 blocks out of the equation, which is a pretty big deal. You can also use it defensively. It's not quite as effective, but because it replaces itself, that's not a bad field case. I think this is a solid playable. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Cobbled Lancer, which for 1 blue is a 3/3 zombie horse at uncommon. As an additional cost to cast it, you have to exile a creature card from your graveyard, and you can pay 3 generic and a blue and exile it from your graveyard to draw a card. This has a cool design. Obviously, casting this on turn 1 is close to impossible in Limited, but if you just trade your 2-drop and then cast this on turn 3 plus another 2-drop, that seems pretty spicy. It's also big enough that it's decent all game long, so even if you don't play it until turn 4 or something, it will be okay, especially if you're taking advantage of this card's efficiency to double spell. The other nice thing about it is that if you're milling yourself, you can cash it in for a card from your graveyard, which is nice upside. It also works that way if you use it to trade and then exile it from your graveyard, you're getting a 2-for-1. This has some decent upside. It might not be super easy to set it up, especially outside of the blue-green deck, but I like the card overall. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Consuming Tide, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a rare sorcery, and it says each player chooses a non-land permanent they control, return all non-land permanents not chosen this way to their owner's hands, then you draw a card for each opponent who has more cards in hand than you. This is a strange card. It can definitely have a big impact on the game, but it is mostly only going to be worth it if your opponent is ahead of you on board. The good news is that if they are, there's a decent chance you'll draw a card off of this, and this will end up replacing itself. The downside is that unless you have some mana left over, you may end up losing some of your cards because you'll have so many. In other words, if you're ahead, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to use this. I also don't love that if your opponent has the best non-land permanent in play, they're still going to be ahead of you on board. Overall, this all makes me pretty skeptical. Most cards we've seen that do mass bounce stuff at sorcery speed have been pretty underwhelming and limited. Your opponent gets to rebuild the board before you. There's just a lot of problems here. It does have a lot of potential. There will be games where it can win you the game, but I think there will also be a significant number of games where this just doesn't do anything. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Cradle of Safety, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common enchantment aura with flash. It has enchant creature you control, and when it enters the battlefield, enchanted creature gains hexproof until end of turn, and the enchanted creature gets +1/+1. This is functionally identical to Starlit Mantle, a card we saw fairly recently that really overperformed. This aura doesn't give the most amazing boost for the cost, but hexproof can be used to counter spells, and it will feel pretty swingy when you can do that. It will be especially nice in the blue-white deck, which pays you off for auras. This seems like an alright playable, just like the Mantle was. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Cruel Witness, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 3/3 bird horror at common. It's got flying, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you look at the top card of your library, and you may put that card into your graveyard. A 4-mana 3/3 flyer is always pretty good, and this lets you surveil every time you play a non-creature spell. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not the most exciting payoff ever, but it does improve your draws over time while also loading the graveyard, and the fact it starts out with such a good baseline is pretty nice. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Diver Skob, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 3/5 zombie at uncommon. It has Exploit, which I mentioned earlier, which means when it enters the battlefield, you can choose to sacrifice a creature. And, by the way, that includes the creature with Exploit itself in a pinch. And it says, when Diver Skob exploits a creature, target creature's owner puts it on the top or bottom of their library. This has a nice exploit trigger as it lets you trade whatever you sacrifice for a full card while still adding a 5-mana 3/5 to the board, and that's going to do a whole lot to stabilize you or put you ahead. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we've got Dreadlight Monstrosity, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a 5/5 crab horror. At common, it's got Ward 2, and you can pay 3 generic and 2 black to make it so it can't be blocked this turn. Activate only if you own a card in exile. This doesn't seem awesome. A 6-mana 5/5 is an ugly rate, even with Ward 2, and yeah, it can become unblockable, but only for a huge chunk of mana, and only if you have a card in exile. Now, by the time you can use this ability, it is reasonably likely you have something in exile because of Disturb and various other effects, but there will be times where that just isn't the case, and without that ability, this card is terrible. You'll play it if you're desperate for a finisher, but I think you're hoping for something better. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Dream Shackle Geist, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a 3/1 spirit at rare. It's got flying, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, choose up to 1. Tap target creature, or target creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. This looks really good. A 3-mana 3/1 flyer is always playable. That's a great rate. You'll be straight up tapping things with this too in situations where doing so allows for better attacks, and that's going to happen a lot. But the fact it can also lock down creatures for a couple of turns is nice too, as your opponent will find themselves in a sticky situation. Can they really afford to attack if the Geist locks down their creature? This is a really good card. It falls a little short of being a bomb just because its stat line is pretty vulnerable, but it's quite good. And it does do its thing the turn you play it too, which is quite nice. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Fear of Death, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, you mill 2 cards. An enchanted creature gets -X/-0, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard. This kind of removal is nowhere close to being premium. Only reducing a creature's power just doesn't do enough. This thing can still block with its full toughness and use abilities, so you don't even get rid of a whole card with it on some creatures. That, combined with the necessary setup, makes this very unimpressive. It does mill you, and it's an enchantment, and blue-green and blue-white, respectively, are interested in those things, but it isn't anything more than a decent playable. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Geistlight Snare, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. It costs 1 less to cast if you control a spirit, and it costs an additional 1 less to cast if you control an enchantment. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. I'm always a bit skeptical of counter magic in Limited. This is a bad mana leak a big chunk of the time, and sometimes it will cost 2 or 1, which will obviously feel much better. But you still have to hold up the mana at the right time for it to do its thing, and it has waning value as the game goes on because it's not a hard counter. I think this is probably just a C-. Next up, it's Gerolf, Visionary Stitcher, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 1/4 legendary human wizard at rare. Zombies you control have flying, and you can pay a blue and tap it to sack another non-token creature. If you do, you create an XX blue zombie creature token, where X is the sacrificed creature's toughness. This set has lots of zombies, of course, especially in blue-black, so he will often come down and give a zombie or zombies in play flying right away, which will change your board state. Then his ability to make it so you can give up creatures to make more zombies is pretty nice. Now, in a lot of ways, that ability just reads, pay 1 blue, tap, give target creature flying, but that's actually pretty good. And sometimes you'll be sacrificing a creature who is no longer relevant at all, and that's huge upside. I think this looks pretty great. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Gutter Skulker, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/3 spirit at uncommon. It can't be blocked as long as it's attacking alone, and it has Disturb for 3 generic and a blue, and it comes back as Gutter Shortcut, an aura with enchant creature, and enchanted creature can't be blocked as long as it's attacking alone. This looks really good to me. An unblockable 4-mana 3/3 is nice, and that's what this will usually be. Then once it goes down, it can lend that powerful unblockability to one of your other creatures, essentially giving you 2 creatures that are must-kills over the course of the game. Now, ideally, the creature is big enough to really be a problem, and you won't always be able to pull that off. But it does make pretty much any creature into something of a threat. It does get some bonus points too from being a great place to put disturbed auras, since, it can't be blocked a lot of the time. I think this is a pretty high pick. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Hullbreaker Horror, which for 5 generic and 2 blue is a 7/8 Kraken Horror. At rare, it's got flash, it can't be countered, and whenever you cast a spell, you choose up to 1. Return target spell you don't control to its owner's hand, and return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. 7 mana is a lot, so when you spend that much, you better be doing something that will have a massive impact on the game, and this certainly will. You can just flash it into ambush and kill just about any creature out there. A 7/8 is just that big, and then once you untap, you'll start being able to bounce things and even return spells on the stack to their owner's hands. Now, you can only do that last part with instants, obviously, so bouncing non-land permanents is probably where you're going to go most of the time. There might be times where you untap and have no spell to play, but even then you're doing alright, and most of the time things just won't go that way. This is a bomb, even with its high mana cost. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Inspired Idea, which for 2 generic and a blue is a rare sorcery. It has Cleave for 3 generic and 2 blue, and it says draw 3 cards, and then in brackets it says, your minimum hand size is reduced by 3 for the rest of the game. This is an interesting card. If it's the last card in your hand, just casting it for 3 is probably best, because it's likely you'll be able to play some of the cards you'll draw, and that mana will be useful. But obviously, if you're casting it at any other time, you'll want to cleave it or be in some trouble. Still, 3 mana to draw 3 is big, and in the later part of the game you probably won't have more than 4 cards in your hand anyway. I think this has enough upside that I would play it in most blue decks, and especially in aggressive ones that will empty the hand fairly quickly. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Jacob Halkin Inspector, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 0/2 legendary creature, human advisor at Mythic Rare. You can tap it and draw a card, and then exile a card from your hand face down. You may look at that card for as long as it remains exiled. You may pay 4 generic and 2 blue. If you do, transform Jacob Halkin Inspector. And he becomes a legendary enchantment called Halkin's Insight, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library face down. You may look at that card for as long as it remains exiled. Once during each of your turns, you may play a land or cast a spell from among the cards exiled with this permanent without paying its mana cost. So even if you never transform this, it's pretty nice since it lets you loot for free every turn, and that's what he'll be doing early. If he transforms late, he's going to start firing off spells for free, and that's going to be absurd. Even if you get it late and only loot with it once and transform it, you're still going to get a ton of value out of Halkin's Insight. He is super fragile, of course, and I think the amount of time it takes before it becomes a card that feels like a bomb keeps it from really receiving a bomb grade, but it's close. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Lantern Bearer, which for 1 blue is a 1 mana 1/1 flying spirit. At common, it's got Disturb for 2 generic and a blue, and it comes back as Lantern's Lift, an enchant creature that gives enchanted creature +1/+1 in flying. This looks like a very good common. A 1 mana 1/1 flyer normally isn't something that's worth it in a lot of formats, but it's a pretty decent play on turn 1 as it can chip in for some real damage. And unlike most 1 mana 1/1 flyers we see, once this becomes outclassed, you can just chump block with it and then disturb it to get a pretty nice aura. +1/+1 in flying can turn almost any creature into a real threat, and sure, 3 mana for that isn't amazing, but remember that you also got a 1 mana 1/1 flyer earlier in the game, and what you have here sounds pretty good to me. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Lunar Rejection, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant with cleave for 3 generic and a blue, and it says return target wolf or werewolf creature to its owner's hand, draw a card, and wolf or werewolf is in brackets. We've seen this card before without the werewolf hate side of things, and it was pretty alright. Bouncing a thing doesn't usually give you a 1-for-1 trade, but because you draw a card with this, that's what this amounts to, and you're usually coming out ahead on tempo too. Obviously, the werewolf hosing upside will feel really good. If you can do this for 2 mana, you're going to be ecstatic. This seems pretty nice for blue decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Mirror Hall Mimic, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 0/0 spirit at rare. You may have Mirror Hall Mimic into the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, except it's a spirit in addition to its other types, and it has Disturb for 3 generic and 2 blue. It becomes an enchant creature called Ghastly Mimicry, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, create a token that's a copy of enchanted creature, except it's a spirit in addition to its other types. 4 mana clones have a pretty good track record in Limited. They get to be whatever the best card is on the battlefield, and whether that means you copy an opponent's thing or your own thing, it'll be pretty nice. What really makes this card great, though, is that when it disturbs, you get to put it on a creature and keep making copies of that creature every turn. That's going to grind out some serious value, and eventually snowball to the point that your opponent just can't win. This is the kind of disturb card that is going to be better in most cases if you just mill it or discard it because its aura form is so good. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Mischievous Cat Guys, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/1 cat spirit at uncommon. When it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card, and it has Disturb for 2 generic and a blue. It comes back as Cat-like Curiosity, an uncommon aura with enchant creature, and it gives the enchanted creature, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Getting in with the 1/1 side of this won't always be super easy, but if you're on the play and play it on turn 2, you kind of have a chance. The idea is that you can put auras on it to really start to get value, and obviously as we've seen, there are lots of auras that would make this into a formidable attacker. Then when it goes down, it of course becomes an aura, and one that grants the same ability to another creature. That's pretty nice because anytime you find a situation where you have an advantageous attack, you can disturb this and stand a good chance of getting that card, and if you get to hit your opponent multiple times with a creature that draws you a card, you'll just win. The downside is, of course, that you need something that already has good stats or a good evasive ability, or it doesn't really do anything. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Necro Duality, which for 3 generic and a blue is a mythic rare enchantment, and it says whenever a non-token zombie enters the battlefield under your control, create a token that's a copy of that creature. Obviously enough, you need a bunch of zombies for this card to be anywhere close to worth it. Otherwise, It's a 4-mana enchantment that basically does nothing. If you do have lots of zombies, which probably means the blue-black color pair, it's going to be worth playing, but you still need around 10 before you get there, and even then, the turn you play this, it will usually do nothing. But if you get to untap, you're probably going to be fine. So this definitely needs a build around grade, since it's pretty much dead weight in your typical deck in the format in F, but in a deck that is constructed to take advantage of it, it's definitely good, a B+. Next up, it's Overcharged Amalgam, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 3/3 zombie horror. At rare, it's got flash, it's got flying, it's got exploit, and when it exploits a creature, you counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. I'm always a big fan of creatures that can counter spells dating way back to the Mystic Snake days, so I'm pretty excited about this card. It just looks pretty awesome. You would always play a 4-mana 3/3 that has flying and flash. It's big enough that it can ambush some stuff, and it's a very real threat. Adding the exploit upside is great, as countering a spell or ability and adding to the board will feel good, even if you do have to give up a creature to make it happen. Ideally, you're giving up a creature that is no longer relevant, or a creature token, or that egg from earlier, but even if you're not, this is going to feel really good. Now, sometimes you will have to play it in a situation where you can't counter anything, and that's going to be kind of a bummer, but it's still a very good card. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Patchwork Crawler, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/2 zombie horror. At rare, you can pay 2 generic and a blue to exile a creature card from your graveyard and put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it has all activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with it. This is a neat card and not a bad late game mana sink to have around, and even early sometimes copying a creature's ability who died and getting a counter can be better than playing a thing, sometimes, but still it starts out small and asks for setup and has a pretty costly ability. It is good late, but kind of medium the rest of the game. And you shouldn't really expect to be getting all kinds of activated abilities either. You're going to get some to be sure, but think about the cards that we've looked at so far and how few of them have activated abilities that this would actually copy. I mean, this is limited. You're not going to get that many activated abilities. But I think this is still a decent card, maybe a little more than decent, but not really anywhere near a card you want to take super early. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Repository Scab, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/3 zombie at common with exploit, and when it exploits a creature, you return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. A hill giant that sometimes rebuys you an instant or sorcery is pretty nice. Obviously, you don't really want to give up a real creature for this effect, as with all exploit. Otherwise, in this case, it's sort of a roundabout way of rummaging, but recurring removal spells is especially potent, and giving up a creature for that is often going to be worth it, especially if you sacrifice a card that brings you some value when it dies. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Scattered Thoughts, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common instant. It says look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 2 of those cards into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. It's pretty funny to compare this to Organ Hoarder from the last set, which was the same mana cost, but put a 3/2 body into play and let you grab 1 card from the top 3. Basically, you were getting 2 cards and loading your graveyard all for 4 mana, and this is what we have now. Something that doesn't add to the board, but has a similar effect. So yeah, this isn't going to be the best common in the set like Organ Hoarder was, but it does seem like a solid playable. Looking at 4 cards is pretty nice for the cost, and loading up the graveyard is worth doing too. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Screaming Swarm, which for 5 generic and a blue is a 4/4 bird horror. At uncommon, it's got flying, and whenever you attack with 1 or more creatures, target player mills that many cards, and you can pay 2 generic and a blue to put Screaming Swarm from your graveyard into your library, second from the top. 6 mana for a 4/4 flyer is not a great rate, but this does do some other stuff. Generally, you're going to be wanting to mill yourself with the attack trigger, since the format does have graveyard stuff, especially in blue-green, but in a pinch, it can mill the opponent if that matters, and there will be rare occasions when it does. This is expensive and slow, but it does load up your graveyard, and it can make sure that if it gets milled, you can still get it back. Though, that's not that exciting. Remember, it will be replacing a card, not giving you card advantage when you use its ability. I think the whole package here is just a C. Next up, it's Selhoff Entomber, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 zombie at common, and you can tap it and discard a creature card to draw a card. Forcing you to discard a specific card type really devalues the effectiveness of a rummage or loot effect. The idea here is to discard something you want in the graveyard, like a creature with Disturb, but a lot of the time you'd rather just cast both halves of those cards. It is nice that this gives you the flexibility to immediately get the aura if that's going to be better for you, but that's still a pretty specific situation. This format just doesn't look like it has enough of a reason to consistently discard creatures, so I'm not super interested in this. It's a 2 mana 1/3 with a useful creature type, and an ability that can be good sometimes, so it isn't an F, but I do think it's a D. Next up, it's Serpentine Ambush, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant, and until end of turn, target creature becomes a blue serpent with base power and toughness 5/5. This kind of card is always just awful and limited. It's easy to imagine scenarios where it does what you want, like when you use it as a combat trick to ambush something, but situations where you actually get to trade this for a card or get any real value out of it are few and far between. We've seen this over and over and over again. They keep printing these cards and we keep coming away with the same conclusion. This is an F. Next up, it's Sky Warp Skob, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 2/5 zombie drake at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you can exile 2 creature cards from your graveyard, and if you do, you draw a card. If this always drew you a card, I'd be really pumped about this. It'd be close to a B. It probably only ends up drawing you a card about half the time, though, which is substantially worse, as a 5-mana 2/5 flyer isn't anything special. Still, drawing a half a card with that kind of creature is fine. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Soul Cipher Board, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon artifact. It enters the battlefield with 3 omen counters on it. You can pay 1 generic and a blue and tap it to look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your graveyard, and whenever a creature card is put into your graveyard from anywhere, remove an omen counter from Soul Cipher Board. Then if it has no omen counters on it, transform it. And it becomes Cipher-Bound Spirit, an uncommon spirit that's a 3/2 flyer that can block only creatures with flying, and has an activated ability where you can pay 3 generic and a blue to draw 2 cards and discard a card. This seems like it may be a little slow. It doesn't add to the board in a meaningful way until it transforms, and it will usually take a few turns for you to get there. Sure, any creature being milled or dying will remove a counter, so if you have a deck that's good at self-milling, you could get it going pretty fast, but you probably can't really count on this being good enough all on its own. I mean, yeah, its ability can help you get there on removing the counters, but if you do see a creature with the ability, there's a good chance you'd rather just draw that than remove a counter from this. Obviously, once it does transform, it's an impressive aerial threat with a very good mana sink ability, but I think it will be too slow in most decks. I think it needs a build-around grade because it's probably a D in a deck that isn't good at self-milling, and probably a C+ or maybe even a B- in a deck that mills itself effectively, and that mostly means blue-green. Next up, it's Steel-Clad Spirit, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 3/3 spirit at common. It's got Defender, and whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, it can attack as though it didn't have Defender. 2-mana 3/3s with Defender are surprisingly not completely terrible. This is because they block pretty impressively early and have enough size that your opponent is usually just going to have to trade with it. This has the nice upside of being an attacker sometimes. I think it's a C. Next up, it's Stitched Assistant, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 3/2 zombie at common with Exploit, and when it exploits a creature, you scry one, then draw a card. This is a nice common. The exploit trigger lets you see 2 cards and make sure that the card that you sacrificed gets replaced. You won't always want to sacrifice the thing, of course, but the fact that you can is pretty nice. And like with all of these, the fact that it can sack itself in a pinch, like if you really need to find removal or something, that's pretty nice upside to have, in addition to the ability to sacrifice other creatures. And yeah, there's enough decent sacrifice fodder type cards in this set in blue and black that I think this seems like a C+. Next up, it's Stormchaser Drake, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 uncommon Drake with flying, and when it becomes the target of a spell you control, you draw a card. This starts out with a great flying body, and the ability it has can be quite nice, especially in blue-white, a deck that will have a decent number of auras, and auras, of course, count for this ability. You'll still play this in just about any blue deck, though, as the stats alone are worth it, and any blue deck at all probably has a decent chance of having 1 or 2 things that target it. Obviously, it will be better in blue-white, but I think you should value it pretty highly because it has a nice floor and a really high ceiling. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Syncopate, which for X and a blue is a common instant, and it says counter target spell unless its controller pays X. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. This is a reprint and actually a pretty reasonable counterspell. X and a blue counterspells are nicely customizable, and you'll find yourself able to counter a spell much more frequently without going out of your way to leave some amount of mana up as a result. Exiling the thing you counter certainly matters in this format too. Now, it is a counterspell, and you have to have the mana up at the exact right time just for this to trade 1 for 1, and that's not awesome. But because it's so flexible, you will be able to still make use of it in the extreme late game, unlike cards like Mana Leak and stuff like that. And you can also use it to snipe a spell early by just paying 1 for X and things like that. Don't go out of your way to leave mana up early, but I'm saying if you just happen to have 2 mana up, you can sometimes snipe something with Syncopate, and that feels really good. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Siphon Essence, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says counter target creature or planeswalker spell, create a blood token. This, not being able to counter non-creature, non-planeswalker stuff, definitely matters, but it does counter the card type people tend to have the most of, and getting that blood is nice upside, and it's a hard counter. Still, it's a narrow enough counterspell that I think you'll cut it a lot. I think Syncopate is going to be the best of these common counterspells that you do run regularly. This one isn't a complete disaster to run, though. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Thirst for Discovery, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. It says draw 3 cards and discard 2 cards unless you discard a basic land card. This is a fun Thirst for Knowledge callback, and it also makes Compulsive Research, an old sorcery speed version of this, look really sad, and both of those cards are pretty good and limited. So yeah, 3 mana to draw 3 at instant speed and discard a land is a pretty good deal, and in some decks in this format, discarding non-lands will be beneficial. It doesn't impact the board, of course, and you don't want to jam too many cards like that into your deck, but I think this looks pretty good overall, and I would value the first copy fairly highly in your blue decks. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Wanderlight Spirit, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/3 spirit at common with flying, and it can block only creatures with flying. This is a reasonably aggressive flyer. Not being able to block ground creatures isn't a huge deal. You're mostly going to want to be attacking with it anyway. It's a good place to put auras. Giving it a C. Next up, it's Wash Away, which for 1 blue mana is an uncommon instant. It has Cleave for 1 generic and 2 blue, and it says counter target spell that wasn't cast from its owner's hand, and that wasn't cast from its owner's hand is in square brackets. So without cleaving this, you will be able to counter things like Disturb, but that's way too narrow and not worth the card. Even with Cleave, this is just cancel, and that's usually a card that's not worth it in limited. The double blue can be kind of rough as it decreases the frequency with which you'll be able to leave up mana to counter a thing, and that's incredibly frustrating, as well as inefficient. I think this is probably a D+, that's what cancel usually is, and I don't see the uncleaved upside as enough to upgrade it beyond that. Next up, it's Whispering Wizard, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/2 human wizard at uncommon, and it says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. This ability triggers only once each turn. This looks really good. I read the text box first, and I was really thinking this would be like a 1/3 or 2/2, so I was pleasantly surprised that it was a 3/2. The trigger here is quite strong, even if you only get it going once a turn, as those spirits can cause a lot of problems for your opponent. Stapling them to every non-creature spell is nice. I can see this being really good in blue-red spells or blue-white auras, as both of those decks will be casting a significant number of non-creature spells. I think this is a B. It's going to take over games when it's left unchecked. Next up, it's Winged Portent, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a rare instant. It has Cleave for 4 generic, a green, and a blue, and it says draw a card for each creature with flying you control, and with flying is in square brackets. This is pretty interesting. As long as you can draw 2 cards with this when you aren't cleaving it, you're going to feel like you're doing okay. If your deck has a decent number of flyers, that's obviously fairly obtainable. If you're cleaving it, you probably need to be drawing at least 3. The fact it's an instant is really nice too, and makes it a whole lot less clunky than it would be otherwise. It can really help you end a game that's in a board stall. Still, setting up situations where it does the thing you want it to do is somewhat situational. The fact you have to have a board state where it's literally a blank card is frustrating, but I think the upside is enough for this to be a C+. Next up, it's Witness the Future, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery. It says target player shuffles up to 4 target cards from their graveyard into their library. You look at the top 4 cards of your library, then put one of those cards in your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This is interesting. It doesn't add or subtract from the board in any way, and in this day and age, that's becoming more and more of a liability in limited, but it does seem like a kind of reasonable late-game play. Using it to remove graveyard stuff of your opponents or to shuffle cards back into your deck that you'd like to redraw, while also giving you some card selection, isn't a terrible deal at 3 mana. It's also not an incredible deal, though, and it seems like you're going to cut this a lot, especially in decks that are really intent on curving out. I'm giving it a C-. And our last blue card is Wretched Throng, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 zombie horror at common. When it dies, you may search your library for a card named Wretched Throng, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. I always think these collect 'em all cards are really interesting and limited. They make for interesting picks, and this is a fun take on those. The main idea here is that you can keep getting exploit fodder if you have multiple copies, but just the fact that it can block and trade and get you another Throng is actually a pretty good card. It's basically a 2 mana 2/1 that when it dies draws you a card. Sure, that card's always another Throng, provided there's one in your deck, but that's actually a reasonable deal. A card like this, of course, needs a range of grades. If you have 1, you're never going to play it. It's an F. It's a 2 mana 2/1 with absolutely no upside. I guess it has a somewhat useful creature type, but that's just not going to be enough. As soon as you have 2, you're looking at a C, and if you get to 4 or 5 copies, it's probably a B- or better. Alright, so those are all my initial thoughts for all the blue cards in Crimson Vow. I'll be back tomorrow with a look at all the black cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of the set review over the next several days, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on some of my other videos, including more of this set review, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you enjoy my content and want to go the extra mile in supporting me and my content, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.